All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Holistic Health Masterclass podcast. This is Brett, and we are doing something that we don't normally do on the show, and that is zero editing, zero introduction. We're actually just hitting the record button and going live with Ted Kuntz. Is that right, Ted?
That's correct.
From Vaccine Choice Canada. You are the president of that organization. And let's just jump right into it, Ted. What's your background, and maybe give us a bit of the scope of what Vaccine Choice Canada actually does?
Glad to. Thanks for inviting me, first of all. This is great to have this conversation with you. I'm the parent of a son who was vaccine injured and has now passed away as a result of his injuries. And so Josh was injured in 1984. That caused me to begin to review something that I took for granted, that vaccines were safe and effective, which is the messaging that we are inundated with from the medical industry. And over those 30 years, I've done extensive research of the medical literature and discovered that what the science says and what they tell us the science says are often two different things. Mm-hmm. And so I became aware of this organization called Vaccine Choice Canada. They've been in operation in some capacity or other since 1984. They began in 1982, the Ontario government they were the first province in Canada to impose vaccination for school attendance for children. And the initial legislation in 1982 did not allow for religious or firmly held conscious decisions to exempt from that medical practice. And so a group of parents lobbied the Ontario government and were successful in 1984 in including personal and religious exemptions, which exist to this day.
Right.
And so that original group of parents was called Vaccine Risk Awareness Network, and their mandate was to preserve and protect our right to informed consent. And they also had a mandate to bring more awareness to the issue of vaccine injury. Many of the families that joined initially were all parents of vaccine injured children.
Right.
My history with the organization, I can't remember when I first joined, but I would say 6 or 7 years ago, I joined as a member, was invited to become a member of the board of directors, and then in December was asked to be the president. So that's my history with that.
Okay, great. And I think it's important for people to understand because I sort of started following Vaccine Risk Awareness Network, so VRAN, right, before they became VCC. And I think what's important for us to put out there out front is that this is not necessarily, and I include myself in this camp, it's not necessarily about anti-vaccine. It's exactly more about an informed choice based on objective information, right? I mean, I think, is that a fair statement to make?
Absolutely, Brett. And that's the challenge that we're facing with this movement is, our title clearly says who we are, vaccine choice. Mm-hmm. And, in spite of our efforts to educate the mainstream media in particular and ask them to describe and recognize who we are and what our mandate is, they persist in using the language of anti-vax. And they do that intentionally. I wrote all of the major mainstream media and very clearly requested that they begin to use the language of vaccine choice or parents of vaccine-injured children or parents for informed consent, because that's the language that represents who we are as an organization. And they, to an organization, have refused to do that. And so what I see is that they're in a campaign of marginalization, of censorship, of dismissing. They refuse to allow this conversation into the public square. And so what you're doing is really an important service to the community because it's not being done. Our voices have been muted. The experience of vaccine-injured children is not being acknowledged. It's being dismissed. And you can't make an informed decision when so much important information is not permitted to be allowed in the public square.
Yeah. And, you bring up something as well that I think is also important for people to understand. And that is that, I've sat in on a lot of these meetings, on government meetings. I've spoken to people like yourself. And I think that there's this misunderstanding or misperception that people somehow just came out of the woodworks and they're anti-vaccine, when in actual fact, most people in the anti-vaccine, quote unquote, crowd are actually ex-vaxxers, people that trusted the system 100%. They went and got their children or themselves vaccinated, and then they subsequently got injured and or died. And I think people forget that. They just think it's a bunch of lunatics out there that have no grounding in science or haven't looked at anything. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, and you're absolutely right. But to be fair, most people think that because that's what they're told by the mainstream media. But you're absolutely right, is that the parents in this group are almost to a person, parents who did vaccinate their child.
Yeah.
And so to call parents that vaccinated their children anti-vax or against vaccination is not a fair statement. The true statement is we did what we were told, and our children were harmed. And we feel an obligation to make other parents aware of that this risk exists, and to do their own research. What I admit is that I wasn't a responsible parent. I didn't do my homework before I allowed my son to take that medical practice, that vaccination. I just went along with what was expected. And I feel a deep sense of regret that I didn't do my homework. What I find remarkable is parents will do extensive research on something like buying a car seat for their child or a stroller, or they'll read the labels on baby food jars to make sure that their baby or their infant is getting healthy food, and we're buying products that are safe, and we don't do near that level of most basic research with vaccinations. We simply accept what the mantra is: vaccines are safe and effective, and if you don't believe that, there's something wrong with you, that you're anti-vax or anti-science, or you're uneducated or ill-informed.
Yeah.
I would say this community of parents are extremely well-informed. And I've had many conversations with my family physician over the years about this topic. And at one point he said, "Ted, I don't know anybody, including my colleagues, who know more about this topic than you." Yeah. They are not taught about vaccine injury. They're not taught how to recognize, diagnose, treat vaccine injury. What they're taught is the vaccination schedule. And now they're being taught a module about how to coerce vaccine hesitant parents into vaccinating. I mean, to me, that's not medical practice. That's, they're selling a product. And I'm really, I was going to say disappointed, but I don't think that word is strong enough. I think I'm disgusted with how this medical system has been captured by the pharmaceutical industry, particularly the vaccine industry. And they've stopped practicing, a basic ethic of medicine, which is informed consent.
Mm-hmm. And, just to sort of drive that point home and bring some context into that, there was a meeting, longtime listeners of the show would be familiar with this meeting, the Toronto Board of Health, I think it was September, October last year, 2019. And there was a motion put on the table to basically enforce mandatory vaccinations in the city, which would obviously then extend to the whole province, right? And at that same meeting, in addition to proposing mandatory vaccinations and removing religious exemptions and medical exemptions, at exactly the same time, we also need to have a reporting system, right, to report injuries. And we also need to have a compensation program to compensate people that have been injured. And when I looked at that in context, I was like, so you mean no injuries have been reported is what you're actually saying, because we don't even have a reporting system. You're also saying then that doctors and medical professionals are not acknowledging it. They have no idea what they're looking for, and no one is being compensated because we don't even have a compensation program. So I think that, people need to be reminded of that, because oftentimes the context is completely lost.
You're absolutely right. So a couple of things about what you just said that I'd like to speak to. Canada is the only G7 nation without a vaccine injury compensation program.
Wow.
And of the top G20 nations of the world, there are only 2 nations who don't have a vaccine injury compensation program: Canada and Russia. Every other, so 18 out of 20 G7 nations recognize vaccines cause injury, and they compensate for those losses and deaths. In this country, it doesn't happen. And, you talked about the Toronto Board of Health. 2 years ago, the Canadian Medical Association at their annual general meeting, so this is the Association of Medical Doctors, they had two motions that I thought were pertinent here. One was a recommendation to make childhood vaccinations mandatory in Canada, which passed by an overwhelming majority. The second motion was to have a vaccine injury compensation program in Canada, and that one failed by an overwhelming majority.
Huh. That doesn't make any sense.
At the same meeting.
Wow. Why is that? I mean, do you have any insight into that or intuitions?
Well, the argument was put forward by those who voted against the compensation program was vaccine injury is rare, and if we have a compensation program, it might negatively impact people's confidence in the program. So it's better not to have a compensation program.
So the perception.
Yeah. So and what it says is, we don't really care that children and adults are injured by vaccination. That the ideology, preserving the narrative, preserving the ideology is actually more important than compensating for injury. Wow. I find that appalling that our medical system has gotten to that place where they're so fully captured by it. The second thing is that the injury is not rare; it's just rarely reported.
Yeah.
And so a study that was conducted for the HHS, Health and Human Services in the United States, I think in 2017, I'll have to go back and look at my date. They recognize that less than 1% of vaccine injury is reported. Less than 1%. So that means that 99% of vaccine injuries go unacknowledged, unreported. Mm-hmm. The reporting system that we actually have a reporting system in Canada, but it's not well utilized. The system is entirely voluntary. There's no consequence for not reporting. And so this is not a system that can be relied upon. And if you were to ask doctors to recognize vaccine injury and report it, they can't do that when they're not taught what is vaccine injury. Right, they're told, like the rest of us are, they get the same, propaganda that we get. And I would say more so is that vaccines are safe and effective. And so there's nothing to report. Yeah. So, and even the reporting system that exists in Canada is not easily available to the public so that the public could look up and say, okay, so how many injuries were attributed to measles, to MMR, to Hep B, the lack of information is unacceptable.
Yeah. And, I've had, I've done a lot of podcasts on vaccines. So, Del Bigtree, James Lyons-Weiler, Jeremy Hammond. Yes. So we've kind of unpacked a lot of the details that you just spoke about. And I would just encourage anyone watching this or listening to the podcast, you can go back into the archives and get into some of those details. But, you're pretty spot on. And as far as I can recall anyway, the last data that we have from the US, which I think was 2016 or 2017, was around 56 or 57,000 injuries that were reported. All right. So if that's 1%, tack on a couple of zeros, and then you've got the actual number. And then if you also consider, this is important for people to know, that most of the compensation is actually settled out of the system. So we don't really, and this is of course the US, because Canada is light years behind in all of this. So we have to look to the US for some of these numbers. So yeah, you're pretty spot on in terms of the underreporting and the underdiagnosis, if you will, of injury. And the other thing I would add to this, the other thing I would add is that there's also a small window post-vaccination that you would classify an injury, right? So, after 6 weeks, well, now it's not associated with the vaccine, right? So you could have autoimmune issues when you're 25 from a vaccine that you got when you were 5. And all of a sudden there's no association, therefore, there's no injury.
Well, and I think that's one of the shocking things that I discovered when I began to really do the research is you discover that vaccines are not required to undergo the same level of safety testing as every other pharmaceutical product. And so they do not do double-blind placebo-controlled studies. None of the vaccines on the childhood schedule were tested against an inert placebo. And you can't determine if a product is safe if you don't test it against an inert placebo. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that the period of safety testing, the length of period that they actively monitor for adverse effects from a vaccine is between 3 and 5 days on average.
Wow, that's it. So 6 weeks,
That's
I
it.
was way out the ballpark.
The only vaccine that was monitored for adverse events following vaccination for that length of time, for 6 weeks, was the MMR shot. They monitored it for 42 days. But some vaccines are monitored for as short as 48 hours, and the average is between 3 and 5 days. And so no immunological problems, no neurological problems. Those will never be discovered in 3 to 5 days. So
Yeah.
it's appalling that we call that our safety testing. And when I see the literature that, our vaccines are thoroughly reviewed for safety, it's just not true.
Yeah.
It's fraudulent.
Yeah, yeah, and again, that's something that I've discussed fairly extensively on the show. So I don't want to get into that too much,
Yep.
because I really want to bring us on point to what's going on in Canada right now. Because I don't know where you want to start with this, but I think this is really the meat and potatoes of what's happening right now and why you and I are talking. But maybe let me just sort of segue into this section by asking you about the legal challenge that you put in. I think you put in a sue or a legal challenge a few months ago, right? 6 months ago or something like that.
Well, we did one in the fall
Yeah,
against
so
the
let's talk
Ontario
about the one in
government.
the fall first, and then
Okay.
we'll kind of So what was that all about, and what's the
Well,
backstory there?
so as I said in my earlier comments, is that back in 1982, the Ontario government mandated vaccinations for school attendance in Ontario, and we find that situation has been appalling. But they became even more aggressive a couple of years ago, where they said if you don't vaccinate, you had to attend a mandatory education session. And then they included an affidavit that you had to sign in order to get your exemption. And the affidavit said that you knowingly are putting your child at risk. Well, this is compelled speech. This is not informed consent. The education session was absolutely appalling in terms of its bias and its lack of evidence-based medicine in order to prove the points that they made. And so we felt it was enough. They have pushed this violation of our rights and freedoms as far as we're willing to accept. It was time to take the government to court, and the decision was made that we would sue the Ontario government for violations since 1982 of our rights and freedoms to informed consent, to security of the person, bodily sovereignty, and the right of parents to make medical decisions for their children. And so that case is going forward.
Yep.
We filed a statement of claim. The government filed a statement of defense, which I thought, if I was the government, I would have been embarrassed with their statement of defense. It was a 15-page document that was double-spaced, that basically said vaccines are safe and effective, vaccine saves lives, vaccines is an important development of modern medicine, and therefore everybody should have them. That was basically their defense.
So the sound bites basically that we hear.
There was not one shred of evidence to support their position. So our response to that is that we are demanding evidence to substantiate their claims that every vaccine and every ingredient of every vaccine is safe and effective.
That's
and
a
so
lot
we've actually
of work.
we've compiled a list, probably about 5 pages long, single space, that says this is the evidence we're going to ask you to present in a court of law. So what we've decided is to hold an evidence-based discussion in a court of law that demands that the government substantiate the claims that they're making around vaccination and justify that their violations are justified.
Okay. First of all, that's awesome. 100% behind you. And I know many listeners and people watching this video are going to be rallying around you. A couple of things that come to mind. First of all, just to circle back, you mentioned the affidavits, and I know a lot of people watching this are from the Ontario area. They're Canadians. That clause that's in there that says you are willingly and knowingly
putting your child
at risk. What are the implications of that? Are there consequences if something else happens, or what does it really mean? Do you know?
And that's the shocking thing. So in their statement of defense, they claim that wasn't actually a required statement, that the parent didn't have to sign that, and that it's only for information purposes only. But the legal advice that we've got is it's included as part of an affidavit. There's no separation out. You put a signature below it. They're saying, of course, you're being, it's compelled speech, first of all. And second of all, you're you're admitting as a parent that you're putting your child at risk. Well, what kind of potential risk does that expose a parent to have their child apprehended? And so, and it's also so incredibly disrespectful that a parent would knowingly put their child at risk. Like no one does that.
Yeah, and I mean, one only has to go and look at what's happening with David Stefan with that whole situation,
exactly.
and he's right on our page. Something that was unrelated to vaccinations altogether, all of a sudden he was pegged with vaccinations, right, and failing to provide the necessities for life, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's something that I've had David on the show a number of times, and we've spoken about that, because that's a very, very slippery slope. Once you go down that road, and it sort of leaves us wide open, to anything could happen to your kid, and all of a sudden, you didn't choose to vaccinate, you put your child in harm's way. Okay, great, we're going to take them away from you, we're going to lock you up. Who knows, right?
It's one thing to apprehend; it's another thing to put the parents in jail, like they did with the Stefans. Like that's. This government has gotten so far in terms of their overreach. It's time that we hold them accountable and stop this tyranny, this medical tyranny that's happening.
Yeah. So let's talk about what's going on now. And what I'm going to do, if I may, is I've been knee deep in the weeds here, looking at all of the stuff that's coming down the pipeline, and I've sort of collated some of my thoughts, because what we're now looking at, and I don't want to turn this into a COVID-19 podcast, but what we're looking at right now is, in the wake of everything that's going on, we've now started to see that while we've all been locked down, that some bills have been passed in Canada, right? We know that there's a pretty shocking bill that was passed in Alberta. We know that there is, I don't know if it's a bill, but I think it is in Quebec. And now there's Bill 188 in Ontario. I don't know if you want to sort of paint the picture. You obviously know about those bills. I think you and I off air decided to try and understand exactly what those bills were saying. But one of the big things in those bills is, of course, mandatory vaccinations, right? So if and I find it interesting and shocking that we went from, very quickly, actually, we got to stay locked down for 2 weeks to protect everyone. Fine, no problem. We didn't know what we were dealing with. Great. All of a sudden, we got to 8 weeks, just like that, right? 8 weeks. And now all of a sudden, we're not coming out until we have a vaccine. Like, we moved through that process extremely quickly. And on the back end of all of that, we're 4 months in at time of recording, and magically, we got a vaccine that's going to be ready to go anytime soon. So perhaps let's start with the bills first, and then I'm going to weigh in with what's actually going on with the vaccine, just to sort of converge those points.
Well, to me, what they've imposed is, what I say is that the pandemic that we're experiencing is not a virus. The pandemic is fear, and they have created this fear. This is manufactured fear. And I was like you in the beginning. I was in the United States at the time that this all unfolded. When I returned to Canada, I was suggested that I quarantine for 14 days. I'm willing to do that.
Sure.
That there was lots that wasn't known about that situation, but we know more now, and we know that it's not as dangerous as it's been made out to be. But they haven't backed away from that narrative. And so, what I see is, for example, we've got some measures now to reopen Canada, which is great, but they haven't backed away from the narrative that this is an unusually dangerous virus that requires unusual measures of containment, isolation, masking, restrictions. And if anything, they have taken that fear and they have used it as an opportunity to impose even more egregious violations of our rights and freedoms. And so the bills that you mentioned, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, these are outrageous bills, violations of our personal space, our privacy, our right to make medical decisions for ourselves and our children. And I don't know why every citizen of Canada is not absolutely outraged with what's happening. We've been turned from free citizens to enslaved citizens, captured citizens in a very short period of time. And the references have been made to Nazi Germany of what was happening in the 1940s, and people forget that Germany was a thriving democracy before Hitler came in and took over and used the same kind of fear tactics, and we're witnessing the same human dynamic of being captured by fear, coerced, and convinced to give up our rights and freedoms. And to me, the details of each of those bills might be somewhat different, but the impact of it is to me, it has people confined, it has them terrified, afraid. We're using this fear to shame our own neighbors, to
Yeah.
This is 1984. I mean, I've heard people now, instead of calling it COVID-19, they call it COVID 1984, which I think is actually a much more accurate. It captures that this is not a virus. It's a narrative that is undoing our society as we knew it.
Well, and I think it's also a narrative that's starting to fall apart. When you start looking at the likes of, and of course this will be very controversial to some people, but when you start looking at what people like Dr. Rashid Buttar are saying, if you look at Judy Mikovits, if you start listening to these types of people who have tons and tons of experience, I mean, decades of experience, there's virologists coming out of the woodwork from all over the world that are questioning the official narrative. And what I find interesting, I've sort of termed it like this, and perhaps you'll either agree or at least have some insight into this. I believe that this pandemic is a Trojan horse to usher in other types of nefarious agendas. And one of them, obviously relative to us, is mandatory vaccinations, because in every one of those bills, nowhere does it say we're just making COVID-19 vaccinations mandatory. We're making all of them mandatory. Just it's a little slip, and that has very, very significant implications, obviously.
I absolutely agree. To me, it is a Trojan horse, and we're being programmed to accept this level of control, this separation from citizens, this wearing of masks, even though there's no evidence that a mask prevents viral infection or transmission. I mean, we're being coerced and conned, and you're right, is that there's no distinction being made here that it's just this particular virus that we're going to consider mandating. What we know is the vaccine industry, and Bill Gates has been very clear with his agenda. He wants vaccines for all humans on the planet. The market that's untapped for the vaccine industries is the adult population. So we've mostly captured children. In most places, the vaccination rate is 85, 90, 95%. Some countries, it's 99%. There's not much room left for growth. And the mandates around childhood vaccination is not to capture the 1 or 2% that are selectively choosing to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. That's not why all of these mandates are in place, to capture that 1 or 2%. It's around setting a psychological condition that says, we know better than you what's needed here. We'll impose these products, and you don't have a choice. And we're doing that around children, and we're doing it now. We're moving into the adult population, which is where the money really is to be made. And we also know that there's more than 270 vaccines under development.
Exactly.
And so, this is the other piece that is part of this, and I'm sure your other guests talked about this, is the vaccine industry is not legally liable for the harm or injuries caused by their product. And then when they can coerce governments to make them mandatory, so they have a product that they don't have to properly safety test, they have no liability for injury, and they get governments to mandate it, so they don't even have to advertise their products. I mean, it's from a capitalist perspective, they've hit the gold mine.
Oh, it's the perfect business model, right? It's the only product that works when everyone takes it. It only works if everyone takes it. And if anything goes wrong, we're not liable at all. I mean, amazing, right? Like, if I could find a business model like that, sign me up. But I think, let's also segue into, let's talk about the vaccine, itself. And I'll just sort of hit a couple of the high notes, because I've been researching this for quite a bit now. People think that a vaccine, and I'll come back to what I said earlier, a vaccine appearing in 5 months out of thin air must raise some very, very serious questions. We need to ask these questions. First of all, how long does it normally take to manufacture, develop, research a vaccine? According to Dr. Paul Offit, who's the godfather of vaccines, if you rush it, 20 years. Normally 26 years. Okay, that's how long it takes. So the question then becomes, and maybe we'll get conspiratorial, but how did we magically come up with the vaccine all of a sudden? How are we that close after 5 months, right? So either we knew about it, that's one, and maybe we don't want to go down that road, or two, we know that we're trying a different method for vaccination, right? So we know that traditionally, if you're using dead viruses or live viruses, that's going to take a long time, safety trials, phase 1, phase 2, etc. But now we've got this newer technology, which is RNA-based technology, right? So we can do things quicker. But I think it's important for people to realize that we've never, ever managed to get an RNA vaccine to work. And all of the RNA vaccines, we're not talking about RNA viruses, by the way, we're talking about RNA vaccines. So there's a difference there. The RNA vaccines are all still in research and clinical trial stages, all of them. So not one single RNA vaccine has ever been approved for human use, right? One. Two, we've known about coronaviruses for decades.
Yes.
Right? We've known about all the different kinds of coronaviruses. We've never been able to manufacture a vaccine that effectively works on coronaviruses. If you want to take a look, go look at the flu vaccine, right? Okay, what was last year's, I think, was 9% effective. It was actually -9.
That's right. That's right.
So again, for those listening, go back to my podcast with Jeremy Hammond if you want to get into the details of that. The other thing that we need to understand is, just like the flu, the flu, we get different strains that pop up every year, right? This is why the flu vaccine has to change. And I asked this, I wrote a blog article, which was all about, this was a month ago now. There was a study that came out of China that showed that SARS-CoV-2, had mutated 30 times at that point.
Right.
The last report I got from someone was 140 times, 141. We've now also identified that there are at least 5,000 genomic sequences. For those listening, go to nextstrain.org, and they're doing real-time genomic sequencing with labs around the world. So my point is this, is if you're creating an RNA-based vaccine that is relying on genomic sequencing, that is mutating all the time. So what are we going to do? Like, are we, according to James Lyons-Weiler, who I've had on the show a number of times, I said to him, I was like, James, help me understand this, right? I'm not a scientist. Help me understand. What are the chances of us actually getting this right? And he said to me, Brett, we've got a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting this right. 1 in 1,000 chance of getting it right. And if we do get it right, magically, we're going to have to update the vaccine every quarter. Not every year, every quarter. And it's going to have to be made specifically from region to region because different strains are showing up in different parts of the world. I just, when you start understanding some of this stuff, it's amazing how much faith people have in the development of this particular vaccine. But the thing that then disturbs me more than anything is, how is the government on board with mandating this?
Yeah.
What are you trying to mandate? No safety studies, no animal trials, no nothing, because we're rushing it to market. I don't know. Anyway, sorry for the rant, but I mean, it's just incredible,
I mean, I'm with you. I find it absolutely shocking. And again, I find that most citizens, and Canadians, I think, are unfortunately more willing to do this than other citizens of the world, is that we'll accept on blind faith that what our government is telling us is true. Or what the medical system tells us is true, is that we tend to be very trusting. And I think we ought to be a lot more skeptical. And I use that in a very positive sense. I think skepticism is a healthy quality to have, but it's absent in many people when the topic is vaccinations. But the piece that concerns me even more is that we've got governments that are knowingly pushing forward an agenda of mandatory vaccination for COVID, when they know, Theresa Tam and Bonnie Henry and, each one of these medical officers know that we've been trying to develop a coronavirus for 20 years without success. That's no secret. That's common knowledge in the vaccine in medical industry. And we also know that this vaccine is that they've been given permission to bypass animal testing.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons they haven't been able to develop the coronavirus vaccine is because it causes what they call pathogenic priming or disease enhancement, where it actually makes the disease worse in people. And the way you test for that is through animal studies, and no other coronavirus vaccine that they've developed so far has been able to get past the animal studies because of pathogenic priming. And yet magically we don't have to test for this one, and we're going to start on humans. And I can't imagine, an ethics committee that would pass that would find that acceptable. First of all, like where is our ethics oversight? Second of all, what citizen would, if properly informed of the risk in the absence of safety testing, would say, stick it in my arm, particularly when 90 to 95% of the population is not at risk of this virus in terms of significant harm. And so to me, that's all risk and no gain.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine any thoughtful citizen saying, I'm going to take that risk.
Yeah. Well, I watched a very interesting video. It's literally from 2 days ago. Is Dr. Paul Offit being interviewed by I think he's the director of Medscape, a big website. If you type in any medical thing, like, Medscape comes up, right? So there's a video with the director and Dr. Offit speaking about, coronavirus vaccine in context. And I'm going to post the link, I think, to this underneath the show notes so that people can watch this, because, if everyone is questioning sources, right? Everyone's going, what are your references? What are your sources? Oh, that's some crackpot, Bob's blog, and they're affiliated with whoever, and I think it's important for people to hear this coming out of the mouth of people like Dr. Fauci, right? I mean, he released under the CDC umbrella on mainstream media that the vaccine is likely not to work, or we don't know if it's going to work. And Dr. Offit has also said, he said, look, if we rush these things, just like you were saying, we have to bypass certain things. And we're going to have to bypass animal studies as one. We're also going to have to bypass population studies. So large-scale population studies where, you sort of slowly drip things out and you pay attention to what's going on, you monitor side effects, you monitor efficacy. And he said straight up, he said, look, we're not going to do that. We can't. We don't have time. So they're just going to throw it out there. The people that are going to get this first are going to be your frontline workers, your grocery store workers, maybe daycare workers, whoever that is, right on the front lines. And then we're going to see what happens. And he says verbatim in this video that we are releasing something out there. We're putting it out there, and we're hoping that it's going to work. We're hoping that it's going to be safe, but we have no idea until we put it out there. Now, again, I want people to view this through the lens of mandatory vaccinations, right? I want to view it through that lens. If you think that after everything we've said that this should be made mandatory, then you obviously haven't listened to what we're talking about. So I'm a firm believer that it's all about choice. If you think that you're scared to death and you want to get the shot and it's going to change your life, you go for it. No problem.
That's right.
But
but don't insist that I make
exactly.
that same choice. Yeah.
Exactly. And what's interesting now is Donald Trump, he released something, I forget, it was like a week ago. There was this article and he was saying, oh, we're probably going to get over coronavirus without a vaccine, on mainstream media, And when I looked at the article in there, they had done surveys with people. They'd done polling and they said, how many of you are going to get the vaccine? Like 50% of people said they wouldn't. And I've read other polls where it's 20, 25%. So I think that people are starting to question now, this is all just come out of the blue. And all of a sudden we've got 5G surveillance. We've all of a sudden got this technology, facial recognition cameras going up. We've got, robotic dogs in Singapore, making sure people are social distancing. This stuff, it didn't just appear out of the ether.
No.
Magically, in 5 months.
This is a well-orchestrated, coordinated, planned event. If anybody, and those that call this a plandemic, to me, are absolutely on target. The fact that the entire world outside of Iceland or Sweden and a few countries have been captured by this narrative and have locked down their citizens with no evidence to substantiate that tells me that there's something else going on here. And, to me, we don't have to go down a rabbit hole. We simply look at what's happening. When else in the history of mankind have we shut the world down like this? Shut our parliaments, shut our courts, violated the rights and freedoms of citizens over something that may cause harm, and the evidence doesn't actually support that. And still we won't retract and say, you know what, we overreacted, we've made a mistake, our apologies, let's get back to normal.
Well, yeah. This is the thing that astounds me is like, why can't, I get it, right? Predictive modeling is predictive modeling. Like you put your best foot forward, and if it doesn't come out the way you expected, then you say, okay, it didn't work, that we were wrong. But the government and the scientists are doubling down now. Right. It's like, oh, no, it still is. And it's like any which way you want to cut it, right? So now people say, oh, well, there's probably way more people infected. I'm like, okay, then let's say that. Maybe the whole country's infected. That still means now that the death rate is even lower. That's so right. Any which way you want to cut it, it's not holding up.
This is not a dangerous virus. We don't need these extraordinary measures. To me, we treat it, the mortality stats are looking like influenza. And so what I say to people is, how would you normally respond during an influenza season? What are the things that you do? You wash your hands, if you're sick, you stay home. We ought to be doing all of those things.
Anyway,
but we ought not to be standing 6 feet away from somebody. We ought not to be putting these cloths, masks on our faces that have no ability to prevent infection or transmission. To me, those are psychological tools that is being used to continue to intimidate us and keep us afraid. They're talking about returning to school and having our kids being masked. I just think, I can't imagine the psychological trauma for our children. They'll be afraid to play with other children, touch other children, stand close. I mean, I've heard stories about, a family finally getting together, the parents and their grandparents and the grandchildren, and they're trying to maintain their social distance. And the story that I was told is a grandpa reaches over to his grandson who's sitting there, and he starts to just rub his toes. And the grandchild turns to his mom and says, "Mom, Grandpa's touching me." And it's like this panic. Mm-hmm. And I just think, oh my God, like how have we fallen so far and been so captured by this invisible boogeyman? Right?
Yeah, and so fast as well, right? I've seen, before we move on, I've seen rules that have been laid out by schools in Quebec. And same thing. The kids have to sit in their seat all day long. They're not allowed to share pencils or crayons or anything like that. They have to eat lunch at their desk. So there's no going outside. There's no after school activities, etc. You got to wonder, like, if you keep doing that, how does that weigh on you psychologically?
Well, the psychological impact is significant, and this is a population that's not at risk from COVID.
Exactly.
And so, and the other piece that this reentry program, to me, it doesn't make any sense. They're reentering by sector. Well, I think, and if I'm wrong, I'd like somebody to explain it to me. Is we know which populations are vulnerable and which ones aren't. To me, reintroduce the populations that aren't vulnerable back into life. But you don't do it by sector, you do it by vulnerability. And
exactly.
So,
yeah.
I don't know how they say, well, hairdressers can now go back and, we can do this, we can do that, but, we can't go to a pub. Like,
yeah, okay. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, no. So let's sort of bring us into a different thing, because I think a lot of people are aware of some of the things that we've spoken about, and perhaps some things that we spoke about they're not aware of. But what are you guys doing now? Because Vaccine Choice Canada you are in the middle of launching a second challenge, and you are now suing the federal government. So perhaps share what's that all about, and what background there.
So that's the news. We've been exploring a legal challenge against the government of Canada and other bodies that will yet to be named as we file our statement of claim. But we came to realize is that the violations are not ending, they're continuing, and they need to be stopped. We need to send a strong message to our government that this kind of violation of our constitutional rights and freedoms is not acceptable, and they need to be held accountable. And so the board of directors made a decision last week that we would formally move ahead with a legal launch against the Canadian government. And we will be using the same lawyer, Rocco Galati, that we're using in our Ontario challenge. He is a constitutional expert in Canada, and he understands better than probably most lawyers in Canada the violations of our rights and freedoms and the need to protect it. And this is, it's a bigger mandate than was the initial intention of Vaccine Choice Canada. But what we recognize is that what's similar is the protection of our rights and freedoms. And we weren't seeing anybody else stand up and be take a position and saying this is unacceptable. These violations need to stop. And so we've made that decision. So on Friday we announced to our members, and we're in the process this week of developing a public announcement message that will go out. And we'll declare that we are going to hold the government of Canada accountable to an evidence-based conversation in a court of law. And we want them to justify that their violations are warranted, are the minimum required, and they're justifiable. And you and I both know that there's more than enough evidence to suggest that that their actions can't be defended.
So what, 100% agree with you. What are your intended outcomes of that? Are we just talking about scrapping any idea of mandatory vaccinations, or are there more
that
details?
Would be a piece of it, but all of this, these self-isolation measures, these masking policies, these having a stand on dots in the store, all of those things is completely unwarranted and unnecessary, and it's not supported by scientific evidence. And so we want to send a strong message to government that these measures are unacceptable for both this and for any other future pandemic. They can't just erode our rights and freedoms, violate our rights and freedoms the way they are. They've suspended our democracy. They've closed our courts. They've suspended Parliament. So our mechanisms of holding them accountability have been suspended. That's not acceptable in a democracy, in a free country. There's no justification for that. We've never done that before. Even during times of war, we haven't suspended our courts and our Parliament. So we want a judge to be able to firmly decide that the measures undertaken by the Canadian government are overreach, are unacceptable, they're a violation, and we want them retracted, but we want a strong message sent that this is illegal. And that be declared.
Yeah, and obviously there's going to be the naysayers who are going to say, well, how do we open things up? What are we going to do, because we're going to put people at risk? And there's just a couple of things I want to add. First of all, I mean, that's incredible. I'm going to ask you in just a second how people can get involved, and we'll loop all of our listeners in. But I wondered to myself, well, this is the way I see this anyway, is we've sort of painted ourselves into a corner now.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I think if after 2 weeks we sort of said, well, it wasn't so bad, wasn't as bad as we thought, let people out, like, let's open up, certain sectors, let's isolate the vulnerable, isolate the sick, let's rush antivirals to market, let's get that out there, right? That to me is a much smarter approach that could still be done right now. Quite easily be done right now. I think that's actually the way to go. But what's happening now is the narrative and the framing around all of this is, and you just take a look at Ontario, right? Well, if we want to open things up, we're going to open it up in phases. Okay. And if we move from lockdown phase 1 to 2 and the cases go up, we're going to go back down to 1. I'm like, so we're going to stay locked down forever, because naturally when you let people mingle, the cases are going to go up. And, so the reason why I bring that up is you're going to have the people that are going to say, oh, just stay at home, stay at home, stay at home. And there's a large body of the population globally that are all for lockdowns, and I'm finding that is quite disturbing, actually, because you're almost like, as I said, we're just going to stay locked down forever. How do we get out of this now? Right. And I don't have the magical solution, but I certainly think that the complete erosion of democracy, of our rights, of our freedoms, of autonomy, I don't think that's the way to go.
This is not sustainable.
No.
This is destructive. It's destructive to our economy. It's destructive to our communities, to our families, to our psychological, physical, emotional well-being. So we can't keep doing this. I was willing to participate in the self-isolation measures to so-called flatten the curve so that our medical system was not overwhelmed in the beginning. They could get, the supplies in place and get themselves set up. We've done that.
Yep.
We should check
Weeks
that
ago.
out saying, yeah, that's right. A month ago, 6 weeks ago, we've accomplished that goal. Now the goal needs to be, what we now understand is we need to develop natural immunity. And when enough people have got natural immunity, we have herd immunity. So, and we know, this is actually, you listen to the world's experts and they would say, this is actually a very easy virus for us to manage. Because the good news is that, the only a very small percentage of the population is actually at risk of this virus.
Yeah.
90 to 95% of the population will be either asymptomatic or have very mild symptoms. And so that's great news.
Mm-hmm.
So let's figure out who the 5% is that are vulnerable. Let's build a containment strategy around that 5%. The rest of us, let's get back into society. Let's have exposure to the virus. Let's develop natural immunity. That's the way you move through an epidemic like this, a viral epidemic.
Yeah.
Lockdown by itself is not the solution. It's a measure, a temporary measure that we've somehow lost track of. And they think the measurement of success is the number of cases that are identified. That's not the measurement of success. The measurement of success, I would say, is how many people have contracted it and developed natural immunity, and how close are we to herd immunity so that our vulnerable population now is safe to come back into society. That should be the measurement of success. So,
I think the other thing is the recovery. How many people have recovered? Far
Absolutely.
more people have recovered than have died or, had permanent injuries or anything like that.
And people are talking about, Ted, you're being hard-hearted about the people that die. I'm not. The acknowledgement is the people that are dying, in many cases, would have died anyways. A high percentage of them would have died anyways. They would have been subject to influenza and pneumonia anyways. They're elderly people. The vulnerable population is over the age of 75 or 80 that have comorbidities. They have other conditions that put them at risk. What I've asked the government is, show me the data that says we actually have more deaths this year than in other years when you include all death totals, and we don't. So, we've changed the diagnosis of how people have died, and that's also suspect. We don't differentiate between people dying of COVID-19 and dying with COVID-19. And so I believe we have inflated mortality numbers, and we're doing that, I think, to justify the narrative. But, when Italy went back and looked at it, they said only 12% of the cases of mortality could they actually attribute it to the virus. The other, I think it was even lower. They simply died with it. So I agree with you, is that they've painted themselves into a corner. They told us this awful story, and they don't know how to back out of that story without losing face. So they got to keep saying, well, it's really dangerous, really dangerous, really dangerous. Mm-hmm. It's not really dangerous. And, I go back to one of Mark Twain's quotes where he says, it's easier to deceive people than to convince them they've been deceived. And to me, we've been massively deceived by our governments and by our medical industry. And we ought to be much more skeptical, as I said, of them. We ought to be asking a whole lot more questions. We ought to be insisting on evidence-based practices as we move forward here. And to me, these isolation measures, social distancing, masking, these are not evidence-based. This is ideological-based measures that are being instituted. And, the question is, why are we doing this? Is it simply that we're embarrassed and we can't back up? Is it because people don't want to, be held accountable for their decisions? Or is there another agenda? And I don't know whether there's another agenda or not. But the fact that this is global in the way that our citizens have been violated tells me that this was a well-organized, orchestrated manipulation of humanity. It didn't unfold the way it normally would. So how did it happen this way? Makes it incredibly suspect in my mind.
Yeah. Again, especially how magically out of the ether, all of these quote unquote solutions just appeared, out of thin air. And all the stuff's been going on in the background while we've been in lockdown. That's the other thing. The bills being passed, the 5G and technology platforms and installations, it's just again, not to go down the conspiratorial path, but
Oh,
it's
but
just it makes you raise an eyebrow, that's for sure.
again, the lack of accountability. So I just saw how the Heritage Minister of Canada, was it yesterday, announced I think $300 million worth of grants to organizations to combat misinformation about COVID-19. Like, come on, really?
Yeah, just call it censorship. It's okay. We all know what it's what it is, and this is the other thing I think is just like, how are people not questioning censorship? I mean, come on, like when a reputable doctor, like you can have a virologist, immunologist, person who worked at the lab, a person who's developed vaccines, a person who's studied microbiology, who checks all of the boxes for 40 years. But if they say anything that's counter to the narrative, they're silenced automatically. How are people not questioning that? It's incredible.
I would suggest most of those people who don't question are glued to mainstream media. And to me, we're being lied to by mainstream media. It's
100%.
a fully captured, controlled medium. It's not what most people think it is. This is not the free press any longer. It's been sold and bought. It has an agenda. It has a narrative, and you have to stick to the narrative. And when you step outside of that, you'll be silenced. And I had a phone call yesterday with a gentleman who said, Ted, I'd like to host an online discussion about vaccination, much like we're doing. And I'd like if you'd be willing to debate somebody who's on the other side of this issue and advocating for that. I said, great, I would love to have that conversation. So he told me that he went out looking for somebody on the other side to participate in this discussion around the pros and cons. And nobody from the other side was willing to participate in the discussion. Yep. And what they actually said is that it was even irresponsible of him to try to hold that kind of discussion. And he just said, I was shocked that you're not even allowed to have the conversation.
It's modern day book burning, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. We're being told a story. It's a compelling story, but it's not true, over and over and over again. And I think for lots of people to pull back the curtain and realize that the Wizard of Oz or the Emperor has no clothes that's too challenging a lie to look at. And so it's like what the Nazis learned in Germany. If you want to tell a lie, make sure it's a big lie, because people can see small lies, but they can't get past big lies. It's too big.
Yeah.
We're in a very big lie right now.
Yeah, agreed. So Ted, just to wrap us up, what is the best way for people to support this movement, to support what you're doing, to get behind this? Because much like yourself, I feel that there is a massive sense of urgency here, that we need numbers. We need numbers. We need it now. We need to hop on this, because what I've seen in the past, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's once things are consecrated into law, then the onus is on us, the people, to prove doubt, right? So if we can nip that in the bud and prevent it from even coming in the first place, I think that's the winning strategy.
Yeah, to me, we have to challenge this narrative. We have to challenge our governments. We have to hold them accountable. So our legal challenge is a piece of it. It's an important piece of it. But don't want people to say, oh, well, Vaccine Choice Canada is going to take the government to court. I don't have to do anything. I mean, one is, I would wish people would support that initiative. It's a very expensive process to launch a constitutional challenge. We've been told it'll probably be in the neighborhood of to $400,000 or $500,000 when it's all said and done. So we need financial support from that. So people that would go to Vaccine Choice Canada website, we have a donate section, that would be appreciated. And so that's an important challenge. I think it's part of what's establishing a legal precedent that holds governments accountable. But we need to be doing this advocacy work in terms of our rights and freedoms every day. We need to be talking to people about. I'm not going to wear a mask in Costco, and I've written a letter to the head of Costco saying, the evidence doesn't support that practice. If people choose to do that, I support people's right to choice, but I will not participate in a business that is taking away my right to choice. And so I need you to know that if you impose those kinds of policies, I will not participate in your services until such time as those policies are rescinded. So to me, we have a responsibility to hold our ground, to declare what our rights and freedoms are. We ought to be having conversations with our families. We ought to be doing the research. We ought to be contacting our politicians, our MPPs, our MPs, and we need to say, I need you to stand up for me. I need you to stand up for our constitutional rights. They are being violated. You know, I drafted a brief. The House of Commons of the federal government has a COVID committee that's made up of hundreds of our MPs. And I wrote a 5-page brief to that committee, and I got a response back yesterday from the administrator saying, Mr. Kuntz, unfortunately, the mandate of the committee is not to accept submissions from the public.
Wow.
I just thought, you've got to be kidding. This is a committee of the government of Canada, and citizens of Canada are not invited to make submissions to that committee. What kind of democracy do we live in?
Yeah,
it's not a democracy.
Yeah, that is crazy. And you know, I just want to not necessarily play devil's advocate, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge and to highlight that this is not about, you know, people versus money, right? You know, because you hear that in the public space as well. Oh, you guys are just for, you know, open up the economy. Money's more important than lives, like blah, blah, blah. That's not what's going on, because the piece that everyone is forgetting is, what are the economic implications for people's lives? And now that's starting to come, you know, 900% increase in suicide calls. How many people are, you know, suicides, alcoholism, domestic violence, you know, job losses, financial ruin. These things also ruin people's lives. And I think that they're more responsible for deaths than the viruses.
Absolutely.
You know, and that is, I think, very important for people to understand, that what we're talking about here should be viewed through that lens and within that framework.
That's right. The lens has been too narrow. It's
exactly.
As I said, we've been measuring the wrong thing. We ought to be measuring the health of our communities. And that includes all of the things that you've just described, because our economy, our livelihoods, our communities, our families, alcoholism, domestic violence, all those things is part of what's being affected by, and I say it's not by the virus, it's by the government's response to the virus. You know, when I see media reports that says COVID-19 is causing, you know, unemployment, to me that's deceptive. It's not the virus causing unemployment. It's our government's response to the virus that is causing unemployment. Let's call it for what it is. Let's hold the people responsible for the decisions that they're making. The other thing is, we're not talking about putting vulnerable people at risk. We're saying, let's acknowledge that there are vulnerable people, but it's actually a small percentage of the population is vulnerable. You build a strategy of safety around the vulnerable people. The rest of the people, we ought to be able to live our lives as normal. If I want to, you know, go for a walk on the beach with my friends, I should be able to do that. If I want to stand closer than 6 feet, I should be able to do that. If I want to attend a gathering with 100 people or 500 people or 20,000 people, I should be allowed to do that. You know, 90 to 95% of the population is not affected by this virus. Let's stop acting like we're all at risk. We're not all at risk.
Yeah, 100%. Well, on that note, Ted, I'm going to thank you very much for coming on the show today and for having this conversation with me. I think it's a very important conversation to have. And just want to say that I'm right behind what you guys are doing at VCC. I think it's fantastic. And I know that your following and your audience and membership has grown significantly over this period because of what you're attempting to do. So thanks again for coming on the show today and for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me and for the good work you're doing and allowing us to have these kinds of conversations. It's important.
Awesome. And for everyone listening out there, have yourself a beautiful day. And if you enjoyed this episode, share it and have the discussion, right? Have this discussion that we're having with people in your circle, with your community, your friends, your family, and so on. So I'm going to sign it off. Thanks, Ted. And we'll catch up with you soon.
Okay. All right. Appreciate it.